Hello and welcome, it's Brew. This time around I would like to talk about the standard deck I've been playtesting for about past 2 or 3 weeks. It's the Monoblack aggro without any splashies. And now I'd like you to give the complete deck and some sideboarding tips for the deck, and also some metagame tips. Let's start with the main deck. Our 1-drops include 4 Scar Hides, 4 Blood-Soaked Champions, and only 3 Tormented Heroes, because a starting hand clogged with 1-drops quickly becomes a liability, and we want some more impactful draws in the mid game. And our other 1-drops include 3 Thoughtseize and 2 Boon Variables. I would talk about the numbers a bit later, how I came up with this configuration. Then as for 2-drops, 4 Pain Seers, 4 Spiderwell Returned, 2 Shining Bloods and 1 Vile Blight. And then our 3-drops, 3 Herald of Torment, 3 Master of the Fist, just 2 Hero's Downfall, but all 4 Mogus' Marauder, and then we can move to the sideboard. I came up with 2 Yam to the Pits, 1 additional Downfall, 1 Murderous Cut, 1 Erebos God of the Dead, 1 Whip, and then disruption spells, 4 Thoughtseize, 3 Despises, 1 Boon Erebos, 2 more Bile Blights, and then 2 Farrakis Cure. And then as for numbers, I concluded that I do want at least some Boon Variables in the main deck, so 2 seem to be the right number. In some matchups I want the 3rd Boon Variables. Those matchups are like Green Devotion decks and Abzan mid-range. Probably not so much in the Abzan aggro matchup, because they don't have that many giant bricks, and I think the matchup evolves much more around removal and racing rather than getting damage through giant bulkers. And then I cut 1 Tormented Hero because I wanted to play some Thoughtseizes and some Boon Variables main deck, and we're not really hurting the deck so much by cutting one of the 1-drop creatures. At the same time, we have enough room in the main deck and some extra numbers of the same spells in the sideboard, so we can actually squeeze all the tools we want without really altering the deck. And I found that if you happen to draw too many of the 1-drops, then the opponent could easily stop your all aggression and all your action, because your 1-drops are not really what you want to draw that often in the late game. I think 4 Pain Seers is a must. You do want that card draw engine, especially if you happen to be on the play game too. And it's just a solid 2-drop, although the Pain Seers and Spellful Returns, I find that I cut quite many of those in certain matchups like Green Devotion decks and Abzan, because they are not really getting through and they're in 2-drop and not such a speed play and not super good at racing or anything. And I would have much better tools for games 2 and 3 against all the green decks. But again, against heavy red and heavy black decks, they're totally okay to keep them in the deck post sideboard. And then obviously you will find yourself cutting some of the Mogus' Marauders in the heavy removal matchups. So they're basically here for all the green matchups, for all the Sylvan Carotid and Course of Krufix stacks. But in all the other matchups, I think it's very plausible to cut some number of those, if not all four. Then moving back to the 2-drops, so just one Bile Blight, basically complementing the Hero's Downfalls. I found that sometimes you just don't happen to draw your land number 3 on time, and then you want to have a removal on turn 2, whether it's Courser or the Lion, the green-white one. So it's basically acting as a third downfall, but just like allows us to keep up the speed if we happen to draw a light hand, a light land hand. Only 2 Sign in Bloods. I've seen some successful lists with 3 or 4 Sign in Bloods. This was a late addition in my testing, because for some initially in the sideboard I had some heavier late game cards in the sideboard, and therefore I went up to 22 lands. But then with so many early drop creatures and plays, I found myself flooded way too often. So 2 Sign in Bloods were perfect in that regard. That allowed me to basically go back to 21 lands and have something in case I get really mana flooded, and it has the incremental option of just shocking your opponent for 2 for some reach in the games which are so clogged on the board. And it gives us another efficient 2-drop for slower matchups and just in general. So there are only 3 Master of the Fist and 3 Herald tournaments. I first played with 4 of each, then cut 1 Master of the Fist, and then finally cut 1 Herald tournament. They're all amazing, you want access to them, but once again, then it became way too many free drops, and my starting hands became not as fast as I would like to be. And cutting the 4th Herald from main deck allowed for additional Sign in Blood. So moving up to 2. Their Herald and Master are both amazing creatures, but for curve purposes they weren't that excellent. And for a while I did have the 4th Master of the Fist in the sideboard, but then I switched it for the extra copy of Empty the Pit, so just put in the second one, because I thought it was way better grind back into the game card, even though there are a bunch of Mango Sprays and Anger of the Gods floating around. But basically both Herald and Master are your best creatures against red decks and especially green devotion decks. With Master of the Fist, with some protection and some removal, you basically can ride this guy like to game win, unless they draw Orbital Colossus or Hornet Queen. But you do have ways to get through that, for instance via Mogus's Marauder, or in case of Arbor Colossus with Luna Variables, or just Fourth Season their Hornet Queen or Colossus away. And Master is a real beast in Jeskai tempo, where Jeskai wins matchup. They just have to spend 2 burns on it, or have to put it on top with Jeskai Charm, although that is annoying, but then that means they're spending 3 mana to answering temporarily 1 guy and not all your other creatures. As for sideboards, I thought that 2 Battle Blights and 2 Fergus should basically cover the tempo matchups, or mono-red aggro in heroic decks, because we also have Despises, Footseizes, Extra Downfall, 1 Murderous Cut, and then against real aggressive red decks you do still have the Whip of Erebos, and clogging your board with a bunch of Fergus Cures seemed like a bit win more. With a normal draw, I think it's still okay to win game 1, but I didn't want to dedicate too many sideboard slots for particular type of matchups. So, as I've said before, third Boon of Erebos out of sideboard comes in quite often against all the green decks, but against all decks like Mardu midrange or Jeskai midrange or Jeskai tempo, I think 2 is a fine number. You don't really need the third one, because in those matchups you're mostly trading with cards, trading removal, trading creatures, but you don't really have to push damage through large blockers as much as against Abzan or Green Devotion decks. And in those matchups, even with all the Magnus Praise and Anger of the Gods, Empty the Pits is way better way to kind of get some edge and get ahead rather than Boon of Erebos. It's basically just trading 1 for 1, but against Corsair Kufix decks you don't really want to Empty the Pits in, because they have so many ground blockers, and it's not worth of the effort. You really want to be like the tempo aggro in that matchup and not just grind through. I absolutely love access of free Despise from the sideboard. It helps a lot. Like against all the green decks, it's one of your better cards, I think, in the early part of the game, and even in the late game it's still okay. So you may secure that the coast is clear and nothing going on. So basically against all the green decks we have post board 4 Footsies and 3 Despise, and quite often if you just jam Footsies and Despise in the early turns to take out their early game, their Keratids and Corsairs, then they're clogged with a bunch of high cost drops in their hand, and in the meanwhile you're just bashing them down with a couple of 1 drops, and then just finish them off with some bestow creatures. Yeah, because we cut 1 downfall from the main deck, pushing in 1 Bile Blight, that's why the 1 downfall and 1 Bile Blight kind of swapped places between main deck and sideboard, so therefore we have the extra Hero's Downfall for all the green matchups, or for all the decks which are clogged with Planeswalkers. Some matchups like the Mardu Planeswalkers, which the Team Revolution played at the Pro Tour, has really a huge number of Planeswalkers, and Bile Blight is not so obscure there, and Downfall is way more important card there. And additional removal in Murderous Cut was also one of the latest additions to the deck, because I thought that after putting in some Silent Bloods in the deck, we do increase the number of cards which we probably want to take out post board against green decks, and Murderous card is an okay hedge. I didn't want a 4th downfall there because Cut is doing almost the same thing, in those matchups, and we do want to have some cheaper cards to play. Then I think Erebus and its weapon, the whip, are at least at one-offs, are kind of must-have in the sideboard of this deck. Whip basically gets you back all the life loss from all the creatures. We do have a lot of pain coming from Thoughtseize Boon and Pain Seer and Sign and Blood, so we do want to cover that. But Deicide is still a card, and because we can't afford to draw multiples of Erebus or Whip, because we don't have a trump like we used to have like in Packrat or just grinding through matchups, we do have to play a tempo game, and we want to curve out, so only one of each. And Erebus is amazing out, not just against green decks, where you want to kind of negate a bit the Nihilist Disciple, because that is just huge tempo advantage. They would gain on average like 6 or 8 life, but it's also a good tool in such sense that while you're beaten with some of your smaller guys or with flyers, your Erebus is often online, and this allows you to basically stop taking a bunch of damage from Polocranus or Coursers or any of their ground guys. Basically, it can even block the Hornet Queen, things of that nature. So all the while drawing your extra cards. Right. As for general sideboarding tips, the cards which you often end up taking out from the main deck are Pain Seers, Spiteful Returns, and some number Morgus' Marauder, and sometimes Sign and Blood, but all the rest cards you probably never take out. Well, against heavy red aggro decks, you do want to swap Thoughtseizes for Despices, that's for sure. And then you never side out Morgus' Marauder against green decks. That would be a giant mistake. Even if you bring a bunch of removals, you still want the Marauders, because even after you side out some of the creatures, they still have to attack through all their giant army, even though they would sometimes have like siege rhinos and maybe some other black creatures like those Rakshas or Death Dealers, but you still have to go past everything else, so you pretty much never take them out against green decks. But once again, against heavy black or red decks, you do definitely take them out. And you do probably side out Sign and Bloods against mono-reds and heroic decks, and probably against Jeskai tempo, I think, because you really want to be the tempo deck in that matchup, and take an extra 2 is kind of a liability against all those burn spells. The card you most only would take in, so Despises, Thoughtseizes, removals. I really do like the 2M to the pit. It gives you so much of actions against non-green decks, but in all other matchups it's you're probably not bringing this in. And now talking about positioning in the current metagame. Before Pro Tour, I think this was not such a great deck choice, but now post the Pro Tour Khans Tarkir, I think that the deck got a little bit better, because ultimately when we're talking about what to pick as your next deck of choice for the upcoming 2 standard GPs like GP LA and GP Stockholm, for which I was playtesting with this deck and probably running it there. Then this deck becomes actually quite a decent choice, because all the green decks, the coarser decks, got slightly worse. They were not so much seen on day 2 of the Pro Tour, and all the grindy mid-rangey controlish decks kind of pushed it a little bit out. It was kind of expected in such a way that if there was a greater number of more controlish, more grindy decks on day 2, then all the green devotion decks and other coarser decks got significantly worse. So without so many decks running Keratin and coursers, this deck becomes way better, because against all the fear decks, like what I mean here, non-green devotion decks, black aggro is quite okay. The only problem was the green devotion deck, because they would just trump so much in the first few turns, so it would be really hard to overcome it unless you draw multiple Magus' Marauder. Of course, we still have to be cautious about Magma Sprays and Anger of the Gods. Some Jeskai builds would start to run them, and I even saw Drown in Sorrow as a 2-off or 1-off main deck in many absent decks or blue-black control decks. But on the other hand, I don't think we would see a lot of blue-black control, even though it's a decent matchup. Simply because it was more of a Pro Tour choice rather than a new archetype which will see a lot of play in the future. I don't think that's the case. It will see some fringe use, but not so much. But still, it was a pretty good matchup, and it's really hard for them to overcome. Perilous Vault is terrible against us. Of course, maindeck Granicer is awesome, or 4 copies post sideboard, but with cards like Empty the Pits and Airless, we have a lot of game post sweepers like that. So Empty the Pits, of course, also is afraid of opponent's Bottle Blights, but still, it's a pretty huge trump. Like, after some removals or some trades, you can easily stock your graveyard with a lot of cards. On average, though, you would still just make, I would say, from 2 to 4 zombies, which is still okay as at instant speed for 4 mana. Which leads us to some considerations about why am I not playing fetchies and why am I not running Murderous Cut main deck. Think it's like that. So we're not a coarser deck, so fetches don't have an added benefit like filtering your top decks in that way. Of course, it could enable better the Murderous Cut and Empty the Pits, but it's still very fringe tuning. Between Pain Series for, let's see, Sun and Bloods and Boon of Erebus, we do take a lot of damage from our own cards, and running fetches is just not efficient enough. I don't run Murderous Cut in main at all, because in a lot of matchups like the green decks, you're not gonna fill up your graveyard that fast anyway, unless you really suicide a bunch of creatures, but then you're not really getting ahead, and you're probably not winning that game. So that's not really gonna happen. And even if you run fetches, let's say as a 6 of like 2 deltas, 2 blasting Myers, then still like you probably will on average in the early turns at least fetch once, and maybe trades one guy off, so the cut will cost you like 3 manas, and at that cost, like Downfall just does much better, I think, because it can kill like a quick Chandra or a quick Sorin, and so on. And in the games where you don't draw your fetches, or you don't really want to suicide a bunch of guys into your opponent's brick walls, then cut is really uncostable. Okay folks, you will find my complete sideboard guide for all the matchups in the link in the description, as well as a bunch of tips on like how to play a deck, and what hands to keep, and what possible changes for certain metagames or for certain events I could see, and maybe some honorable mentions for the cards which you might play outside this deck list. Thank you for your attention. See you later.